Kia ora and welcome to this Manaki Whenua LINKOnline Webinar. There's a little difference today in that I don't think you can see us. Rest assured, the whole team is here. Tiffany in the background helping out to make everything work, and me ready to moderate your questions. But sorry, the webcam element of the platform is not working for us today. So bear with us. We are here. Today we're presenting information about a 5-year MBIE Endeavour research program. It aims to help farmers and all the agencies, businesses and others who work with farmers to tackle increasingly complex environmental management challenges. We and our collaborators from across the science sector and industry are now about 18 months into the program, and Susie and Fraser, who are the joint program leads, will present what the program is covering and a few insights on what we've learned so far. I'll be back at the end to help with your questions, so don't forget to put them in the chat box as soon as you can. But now, over to you, Susie.
Thanks a lot, Christine, and I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you everyone else for joining us today. I'd like to specifically acknowledge our fabulous set of partners which come from CRIs, universities, consultancies, plus universities from both domestic and also New Zealand and internationally, but also our regional council and our industry partners as well. So we really greatly appreciate the fantastic research team that we've got here. So thank you again. We're just going to share a little bit about the program and then sort of some little bits and pieces of information that we hope that you find interesting as we go through. So just to, before we get started, I'd like to sort of provide a little bit of a background of how we got to this program and how it sort of came about. And essentially what we were seeing that there were many farmers out there that were willing to take voluntary steps to reduce their environmental impacts, but that journey was really slow. And when we started talking to other farmers and we started talking to sort of industry folks and councils, they were seeing the same sort of thing. And we sort of took a step back and said, okay, so what could we do to try and make that journey a little bit quicker? So increase the rate of that people making change and the number of folks that are making change. And so we then started to look sort of the broader context. And there was 3 things that were sort of coming through sort of at this high level. The first and foremost was that farmers were facing multiple and often conflicting pressures at the same time. So this was something that came up all the time. And then we're also starting to hear that the operational environment around farmers was not being recognised as decisions were being made, and that there was institutions and organisations that sort of interacted with farmers that were creating these really challenging decision pathways that farmers were finding really hard to follow. So these were kind of high-level things that were coming through. But then there were 4 things that came through over and over and over again. And firstly was that regulation was the primary instrument or the primary lever that government was using to interact with farmers around their environmental performance. And there was no real recognition that farmers were willing to take these voluntary actions themselves. The next was around the financial sort of situation. The existing lending options were really reducing the ability for farmers to make their own decisions and really starting to lock in what we call the status quo. Another thing that was coming through was that farmers were increasingly being influenced by a wider group of people, but we weren't actually leveraging these people to help support farmers make the changes that we really wanted. And then lastly, there was a whole bunch of private and public narratives that were out there swirling around that were really sort of reinforcing the negative viewpoints of farmers. So this was kind of the context we were sort of working in. And so we had a really quite a simple premise, and that was that there's lots and lots of pressures that farmers are facing at the moment, and all these pressures are making it really difficult for them to make decisions. And so if we were able to identify and use some of these leverage points within those systems surrounding farmers, that we can enable them to make change. So in essence, the aim is relatively simple, and that's to give land managers or farmers greater confidence and agency to actually improve their environmental performance. So in other words, if we can declog the stuff that's surrounding them, they're able to make cleaner, clearer decisions that will be beneficial for the environment in the long run. And so when we talk about sort of that middle and we go down to the bottom of that slide, you'll see this bell curve, and it's a really simplistic sort of sort of a diagram of how we were thinking, is that if all farmers fit on a bell curve, some are acting and some are not acting, but if we can actually move that bell curve just a little bit to the right, we'll have more people doing more environmental actions. So it's a fairly simple premise there. So if we turn to the research itself, there are 4 main areas that we're looking at and then 1 underpinning space. So we've got work around interventions, investment practices, agents of change and narratives. And I'll go into these in a lot more detail in a minute. But you might notice that these coincide with the yellow boxes from 2 slides before. So these were the things that we're hearing over and over again. And so this forms some of the more detailed analysis we're doing. But just as importantly, we realise that there are lots of things going on and we won't have identified all the really important leverage points within a farmer's operating system. So we have an overarching piece of work that's also looking at those wider systems. And so that piece of work is we've called agency and systems. And so here what we're trying to do is develop a conceptual framing for our research, but probably most importantly is to try and explore the interactions between the systems in the farmer's operating environment. So looking more broadly to see what other leverage points are out there that we haven't actually covered by our research. And that is so others can pick up on that research or potentially ourselves in terms of finding additional research funding to do that. So what we've got at the moment is we've gone out and spoken to quite a lot of farmers, and I thought it might be interesting to share some of the challenges that seem to be coming from the broader systems that surround farmers. And we've categorized them, but I'll give you some little tidbits and sort of bits of quotes that are sort of coming through as well. So the first one is everything, everywhere, all at once. And so this, we had farmers saying, this is just too much. There were guidelines, then plans, and now there's new plans. I can't keep up. I'd follow the rules if I actually knew what they were. So that's a sort of this concept of there's just so much going on all around us that it's really hard to work out what's what. There was also quite a few comments around contradictions and conflicting goals. And so a really nice sentiment that somebody put forward was that they're really supportive of water quality regulations. However, on their particular farm, it requires a lot more fences and they've got really difficult terrain. And so that starts to create safety issues. And so as a result, the family is doing all the fencing and not the staff, just so that they can actually think about the HS&E sort of requirements that they're also facing. Another area is around optimizing or satisficing. And so an example of this was where you've got, you had a farmer that sort of said, look, I'm in a moderately healthy waterway. They've got ducks and mayflies and all those wonderful things in their waterways. But they're hearing that people are saying we are bad and we have to stop farming. But they start to think about, well, what about succession, farm viability, and what about the viability of the services in town and the wider community? And so the questions that they're asking themselves is, should we actually nuke the economy to get better water quality if our water quality is okay at the moment? So just another interesting sentiment that's coming through. Another one was we've turned untrustworthy, unfair and incompetent. And that sounds a bit harsh, but this is the sentiment that's coming from some of the farmers that we've been speaking to. And an example of this is the rules and regs that are coming in are just not workable. And you can tell they've been designed by people who have no idea about the industry. And so an example that was given was around the wintering regulations, where all the crops had to be planted by October the 1st. And that's all good for Waikato, but not for Southland, where it's still frosty on the ground. So that was an example of how farmers have seen the inappropriateness of some of the regulations that are coming through. Another was around fishbowl farming, and this is the fact that everyone's looking at them at the moment. And one sentiment that came through was that the dairy industry is probably a little bit more used to this. They've been in a fishbowl for a lot longer, but the sheep and beef farmers, it's a relatively new space for them. And so they're having to learn sort of how to deal with that. Then we've got farming by numbers. And this was a really interesting example of something that somebody said. They've said, we have everything automated now, so the reporting is virtually a push of the button. But we have to send these reports to all these different agencies and different people, and they all want a different 12 months. This is dumb. Then he goes on to say, I love numbers, but I want to slap the shit out of the computer when I have to keep on changing the dates. So just the frustration of needing all these numbers, but we haven't got ourselves together enough to make sure that farmers only have to present the one set of figures the same time to different groups. And the last is around a myopic system. And so what farmers are seeing are things like, you've got to destock, or vaccines are the solution. But actually, that's just one aspect of the life that they live in. And by everyone focusing on one thing, they are not seeing the broader picture that farmers have to deal with, which might be around nutrients and animal and human health and what's the nutrient content for their farmers, etc. So this was just an example of some of the challenges that are sort of coming through, and you'll recognise that within those challenges are some of the things that we're touching on, but there's also other things that we aren't necessarily touching on in the research that we're doing at the moment. So the next area of research is around policy interventions. And these are the sort of the approaches that regional councils, central government, or even processors, for example, might use to help change the choices or influence the choices that people make and therefore the behaviour. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see the things that most people think about. So this is regulation, fiscal, non-fiscal things. So fiscal might be sort of grants and subsidies or even potentially taxes. It could be certification programs, environmental certification programs. And then on the right-hand side, we've got something called nudges. And nudges are these small, low-cost things that just do little taps to help people or influence how people might be thinking. And there's kind of three sorts of nudges. One's around information, so you might present information differently, make it more or less visible. You might change how information is structured, so you might put in some defaults in there. So it might be an opt-out versus an opt-in kind of decision that somebody might need to make. And then there's a decision assistance, and this is where you might be providing reminders or asking people to actually commit to something. And so within this space, what we're tending to see is that most organisations in New Zealand tend to use the three columns on the left. And in this program, we're purposely not looking at regulation or fiscal disincentives. A lot of those things take years or decades, and our research program isn't that long. So we are focusing primarily on the green boxes, but more so on the nudges on the far right. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to identify the interventions that might be utilised by policymakers or even processors, and what could be the more helpful interventions or that we could use to help incentivise voluntary change by farmers. We're then going to test these in the lab, the interventions, and we're also going to sort of test the behaviours by using board games. And out of that, we'll provide some information on how we might be able to test these actually in the field. And so the idea here is we actually go and get people to, we test these in the field so that before they go wider or bigger or used more generally, that we have a fairly good idea that they're going to work, or that the interventions are going to have the behavioural changes that we hope are going to happen. And then we've got a modelling component there, so that we can look at, well, what happens if we take some of these more helpful or successful interventions and scale them. And so at the end of this, we really want a range of interventions and designs that effectively incentivise voluntary change. Another area of work that we're looking at is investment practices, and there's two aspects to this. First is around alternative lending arrangements, and this is where we're exploring bank and lender relationships, in particular around farmers with high levels of debt. And so what we're doing here at the moment is exploring different borrowing arrangements, potentially how we might be able to renegotiate loans, and look at how changes in these and how we might be able to think about these things actually benefit both the lender or the bank, and then compare between ownership structures. And when we talk about ownership structures, we are talking about corporate versus family versus Māori farms, for example. The second part of this particular area of research is really looking at facilitating Māori farm growth. And this is where we're going in and we're trying to categorise Māori farming models, their transition pathways, and their interactions with their banks and lending practices, just to improve or identify what are some alternative pathways for farmers. For Māori farmers. And some interesting things that have been coming out, which we thought would be helpful to share. This is around Māori agribusiness collectives, and I'm just going to say that the percents there are not necessarily known. These are based on the expert judgment that my colleagues have gotten from the literature, and part of the research here is to go in and actually quantify some of these things. But some of the critical constraints that seem to be coming up for Māori agribusiness is around access to premium markets. That's by far the biggest. And then accessing capabilities and skills and knowledges. So this is around governance, management, operation on farms, and then even more specific skills they might need to address a certain problem. And then it's around relationship difficulties that they might be having within their collective. And then we get to access to financial capital and then strong regulatory pressures. And I found this particularly interesting because I've always heard, or the common rhetoric that I've often heard is around how financial capital was the biggest constraint. But when my colleagues have been looking at this, it's come out that that might not be the biggest constraint. It's certainly a constraint, but not necessarily the biggest. So what we don't know is, in that transition pathway going from when you get land back or you newly form a collective all the way through to a highly commercially viable enterprise. What are those constraints that become more important at different stages of that transition? And so this research is all about looking at all these different aspects. I'm trying to provide some insights into where we have to take some actions to help Māori agribusiness. In terms of agents of change, these are the people that influence farmers. And we are looking at both Māori and non-Māori land here. And we're looking at a broader range of people that influence. So typically we think about advisors or bankers or things like, people like that influence farmers. But we've purposely gone a little bit broader with thinking about artists and school students and schools and social movements, as well as non-human agents. And this is particularly important for Māori landowners. This might be different insects or native plants or connections with the land. And so what we want to do is actually understand how the approaches they use to influence farmers, and then get some evidence on how effective the different types of agents are and the influence approaches they use, and whether those influence approaches and those agents are actually currently being supported by people like regional councils. So trying to get a feel for, if there is a broader group of people that are influencing farmers, how much are they being supported out there? Another really important aspect of this particular piece of work is around how well these approaches work with increasing complexity. Over time, we've seen that the life of a farmer and the life of the systems around farmers are becoming far more complex. And as things become more complex, we have to ensure that we've got the right approaches to be able to continue to appropriately influence and support farmers making the change that they actually need to make. And then we sort of want to do some work to try and make that full range of effective agents more visible and then supported as well. So really it's all about how do we determine what some effective influence approaches are, get them used more widely so these people can help facilitate greater on-farm environmental action. And then the last area that we're working on is around narratives. And so narratives are the stories that are swirling around farmers. And as I pointed out right at the very beginning, these narratives are often reinforcing the negative attitudes towards farmers. And so part of this work is to identify what are the narratives out there in communities about farmers. And then once we've got an understanding of what those narratives are, try to understand what farmers are hearing and then how they're responding to those narratives. And then a side piece of work that's come up after we've started is to also talk to people who interact with farmers and ask them how they think or what they think farmers are also hearing. And so once we have a really good understanding of basically what farmers are hearing and how they're responding, look at how we might be able to reframe those narratives. So looking at what we might like to focus on, what to say, and then also what not to say. And with those reframed narratives, we go out and socialise those narratives with communities and then try to get those narratives picked up rather than the more negative ones. So that's one aspect of that research, but the other aspect is trying to influence policy. And what we're trying to do is to understand how narratives could possibly influence policy development and then getting those narratives in front of the right decision makers so that they do actually have some sort of influence. So again, it's a fairly simple kind of process here. It's really wanting to provide positive emotional cues of farmers through the reframe narratives, and then enable policy formulation that actually does account for the farmer's frame of mind, which makes it much easier for the farmer in the long run. So just a little bit of an example of what's happening in this space. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you'll see lots of squiggly boxes and diagrams, etc., etc. And so these are the narratives that we've taken from newspaper articles, from social media, from websites, from industry reports, etc. And so this was all trying to identify what is that full suite of narratives that are out there. And so what we've done with these narratives then is we've gone out to farmers and also people that interact with farmers to work out sort of what we're calling personas. And so these personas are basically groups of people that are influenced by the same narrative. And so this is an example of one persona that's come through from talking to people who interact with farmers and how and what they think farmers are hearing. So within this one is like, we need change now. It needs to be big and holistic to ensure we're able to protect our environment for future generations. At the moment, we're not being good kaitiaki, as the balance between the productivity and our environmental impacts are actually damaging our whenua or our land. And then lastly, we need to get industry on board so that the incentives are there to make the major transformations now. So this is just an example of the types of narratives that are that these kinds of people are seeing or hearing. So just in, the premise of the research is really quite simple. It's just that the farmers are facing lots and lots of pressures. And if we can find effective leverage points to reduce some of those pressures from that wider system that surround farmers, then this will give farmers a headspace to be able to think about their farms going into the future, feel empowered, and have the agency to make their own decisions on how to move forward in terms of the environmental performance. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions. And my colleague Fraser is also online as well to answer some of the curly questions I might not be able to. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susie, and welcome in there, Fraser. Now for the exciting part of the webinar where we put some difficult questions to Susie and Fraser. Now I did notice on some of the questions that have come in that they really relate quite deeply to other specific aspects of the research. So rather than battle our way through them here now, we will come back to you all with answers to those questions, and we always post them to the website alongside the presentation itself. So if you were curious about any of those things, there will be more information to follow. But I'm going to start off with a really simple one. Is this program just about pastoral farmers?
No, not at all, actually. Lots of examples come up around pastoral farmers because they're the people that are supposedly feeling a lot of the pressures at the moment. But we're purposely talking to a lot of arable and horticultural folks, as well as forestry as well.
Thanks, Susie. And Paul was asking, what methods of engagement have you used to collect the data that you've presented?
So at the moment, it's mainly interview based, but it's across the board. There's lots of different approaches that are going to be used. So a lot of in-person interviews have been used at the moment so far in terms of the data that's been shown at the moment. But there will be things like with schools, we're working with a couple of schools. It will be sort of working in groups with school students in terms of how they might influence. We're using vignettes, so that will be like games online that some of the Māori farmers will utilise. In terms of the games around the interventions, they're board games, so we'll be interacting with communities using a board game as a way to do that. We'll also be doing trials where we'll be engaging with farmers in catchments, for example, and seeing how they respond to different things. So it's really a mix of different approaches that will be utilised through the program. Fraser, is there anything else there that I might have missed off the top of my head?
No, I think you've covered the vast majority. There's, like, for example, we have an approach called Q-sort methodology that's being utilised in the narratives approach that is meant to look, to enable individuals who are going through that process to assess different narratives and how they view those. So that's very similar to an interview, but it's sort of a structured approach to collecting that information. But Susie's right; it's extremely varied right across the whole research program.
That's great. Now, on the other side of the information question, how are we sharing this information with MPI, MFE and regional councils?
So there's a couple of different ways to do that at the moment. I'm going to be very honest and say that we've only just started to have information coming through, and as we have more concrete results coming through, then we'll obviously be stepping up and changing engagement. But we actually do have some groups as part of our research program. So we've got 2 regional councils and one of the industry groups who are not just there, but they are actually participating as researchers in the program. So that provides a really nice way of getting a lot of the information back to those regional councils and that industry group. So that's great. We also have a stakeholder reference group of which all those folks you were talking about there are all members on that. And we are using, that's a horrible thing to say, but the aim of the stakeholder reference group is not just to be somebody that's show and tell, but what we're trying to do is to test some of these things with that steering group before we actually go out. And so an example around that was the Q-sort that Fraser was just talking about, where originally we had thought, well, look, we should be just, we're just going to focus on what farmers are hearing. But the members of the stakeholder reference group sort of said, well, actually, you probably should also be talking to those people that interact with farmers to ask them what they think farmers are hearing as well, because that'll probably provide another set of interesting information that you might like to put into the mix. So there's going to be a variety of different ways.
Great. Two quick questions now on the intervention side of things, which might be early days, but to what extent have you drawn on international experience around the effectiveness of policy levers as opposed to the New Zealand research and testing?
There's very few nudges actually used in New Zealand, so that's why, and they have been used in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa actually. And so that we have gone out to that international literature to try and sort of say, well, what else is out there? And so, yes, most definitely. The reason why we want to test stuff here in New Zealand is essentially because we just want to make sure that we've got the context right in terms of the right context, but also the instruments that the interventions that we're looking at do make sense in a New Zealand context.
And I think that segues us nicely into what I suspect will be our last question. Are the regulators willing to change from blunt instruments to nudges?
I think that would be wonderful, but I'm going to say something here, sorry, which I meant to say in the main part of the talk actually. The way nudges can be worked is potentially a substitute for one of those more blunt instruments, but just as importantly as a complement to those blunt instruments. So I think we have to think about nudges in 2 different ways. I think in many situations around New Zealand, nudges to get movement before regulation comes in place could be incredibly effective. For example, it might be in sort of the biodiversity space, for example, because we already have regulation around water quality and arguably climate as well. So in those 2 contexts, you might want to start thinking about where, how could nudges actually complement those regulations to get things moving. The other place where we've been talking about where nudges could be quite helpful is on the operational side. There are some people within regional councils that really want to sort of help incentivise change, but they don't have actually any policy making ability. So the use of nudges can be a really powerful tool by that, and to do that. And Auckland Council is one of those councils actually in New Zealand, the only one I know of actually, that does use nudges, and they do it in that context.
But just to add to that, Susie, from all of our discussions with regulators, regional councils and so forth, has been a willingness to also understand how they develop these processes and how they are impacting upon how farmers are making decisions. So the answer to that and that question, from our perspective, seems to be yes, they are willing to have a look at that.
Fantastic. Look, we're out of time today, and there is a massive list of really interesting questions. I want to reassure everybody that's taken the time to ask a question that you will get an answer from us, and we'll share those as well. One of the key things I can see here already is that we need to come back to you about this program with more information on some of the areas of work and how we're progressing. So that has been noted. I'd just like to finalise by saying we're online every day next week with a short series of webinars around our remote sensing research. I'm sure that many of you will be interested in that as well. So if you haven't already registered for that, you can find it on our website. So I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone for joining us today, and to Susie and Fraser for a great presentation. Thanks very much. Mā te wā.